Hi, my name is Brady.
Hi, I'm Merritt.
And this is the Team Radio Podcast. Welcome back to the Team Radio Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things F1, especially race recaps. In today's episode, we're going to be reviewing the Azerbaijan Grand Prix at Baku. And let's start with our qualifying recap.
Yeah, so quickly, with qualifying on Saturday, lots of stuff happened. Most importantly, we have Charles Leclerc on pole again. So this is the second race in a row where he is on pole. And just like his pole position in Monaco, he got it because of a red flag incident that ended Q3 early. And
this red flag, just like the one in Monaco, was caused by a Ferrari car. Although the red flag this time around was caused by Leclerc's teammate, Carlos Sainz. Carlos Sainz ran into a bit of trouble with Yuki Tsunoda, and Yuki Tsunoda actually had a very good day. He made it into Q3 for the first time in his career before that crash that, of course, ended the qualifying session.
Yeah, and speaking of crashes, we had so many red flags and also yellow flags during qualifying. I think we had 4 red flags total with the likes of Lance Stroll, Antonio Giovinazzi, Daniel Ricciardo, and then of course, like Brady mentioned, we had a whole incident where Yuki went to the wall and Carlos was following right behind him, kind of got spooked by it, didn't have enough room, had to go down the runoff lane, ended up hitting the wall as well, and of course that brought an end to Q3.
And just to quickly run down the top 10 of qualifying, we had Leclerc on pole, Hamilton P2, row 2 was made up of Verstappen in P3, Gasly P4, Carlos Sainz was P5, followed by Lando Norris, Sergio Perez, Yuki Tsunoda, and bringing up the rear were Fernando Alonso in P9 and Valtteri Bottas in P10. Let's move on to our next segment, Poles and Pit Lanes, where we talk about the 3 biggest winners and the 3 biggest losers of the day. Our first pole is none other than the driver of the day, 2 races running, Sebastian Vettel, for Aston Martin. He won Driver of the Day pretty handedly in Azerbaijan, as he should. He qualified P11, only 3 thousandths outside of Q3. But unfortunately, he didn't make it through, started P11, but made his way all the way up to P2, securing Aston Martin's first ever podium in Formula One, as Aston Martin, that is. And even before the safety cars or red flags that really made up a lot of this race, Vettel was making his way through the field with relative ease. This is a track where he feels very comfortable and he's had a lot of success before, but it was the Lance Stroll red flag. Of course, he never wants to see his teammate go down like that, but after that red flag, he was able to pass Charles Leclerc and eventually Pierre Gasly to take P2.
And speaking of Pierre Gasly, that's actually our second pole, which makes me very happy to say because he is one of my favorite drivers. Gasly had a great qualifying day. He qualified P4, and then eventually in the race, with a little bit of back and forth going up and down, he managed to secure P3, first podium of the season, and great for AlphaTauri.
Gasly also briefly held the fastest lap of the race for a little bit.
That's true. And after the second red flag incident in the final 5 laps of the race, which we will get to, of course.
Oh, we will.
There was a massive fight that broke out for P3 with Charles and Lando, but especially with Charles. I mean, both Charles and Pierre were side by side. We didn't really know which one was going to come out. But Pierre really held strong. He, as we've seen over the last 2 races, is great at defending his position and secured that podium.
It's really cool to see Gasly come into his own as a driver, especially after his whole Red Bull debacle from years past. It's just, how can you not root for the guy, right? Let's move on to our final pole. Who won the race? Checo, Sergio Perez. If we did not mention him, we would be probably the worst F1 podcast of all time. Checo was the hero of the race even before he won. I mean, he qualified P6, ended up winning the race, of course, but even before that, he was overtaking cars early and often, making his way all the way up to P2, ahead of Lewis Hamilton, and allowing his teammate Max Verstappen to gain a pretty sizable lead over his Mercedes counterpart. He did exactly what Mercedes wanted and defended Max from the hound that is Lewis's Mercedes vehicle. Checo also contributed a couple of fastest laps. He managed to stay ahead of pretty much the entire pack after the Lance Stroll red flag. And during the final restart, he pulled out some heroics and was able to sneak past a wildly driving Lewis Hamilton in order to secure the win.
And Brady, this brings us to our pit lanes. Either the biggest blunders of the day. And who are we talking about first? Lewis Hamilton?
Merritt, that's so strange. He was P2 for much of this race. Why is he a pit lane?
Well, listen here, guys. Lewis Hamilton started P3. I mean, we've seen better from Lewis Hamilton, but P3 still amazing. Still a great way to start the race. Lewis ended up P17, Brady.
How did that happen?
Now, listen, Lewis struggled a little bit throughout this race. Before any red flag incidents, we had some situations with pitting that had Lewis's slow pit, which was 4.6 seconds. Not what we want to see. We want to see a pit stop that's around 2 seconds. That disadvantaged him. He fell back down when he came out of the pit lanes, was around P11, was able to make his way back up slowly and made it up to P3, was chasing both Red Bulls down. And then, of course, we get our final red flag and the final restart. And in the formation lap, we start seeing smoke come off of the tires of Lewis Hamilton.
And a lot of it.
And a lot of it puffing up behind Gasly. Poor guy getting a whole mouthful of that stuff. But once the formation lap ended and they were able to restart, it was clear that Lewis Hamilton was going to pass Checo. He was going to go into first position. But then he didn't turn. He kept going straight and was forced off into the runoffs, effectively making him drop all the way down to P17, which, because of other cars having to retire, which we will get to, was the lowest you could get.
And it's just absolutely the worst luck you can have. If you're going to lock up at any point, that was about as bad as it could get for Hamilton, with the entire grid right behind him thanks to the restart. Mm-hmm. He dove up the inside line, locked up his front wheels, and wasn't able to turn quick enough.
And it's important to mention that this final restart had 2 laps to go. 2 laps, Brady. And, of course, if he finishes P15, that means he dropped all the way down behind both Haas drivers.
Unreal.
This right here, Mazepin, finished the race ahead of Lewis Hamilton.
A truly historic moment.
Now, Brady, just to clear it up for some of our listeners, can you explain a little bit further what happened specifically with Lewis Hamilton's brakes and his tires and that whole situation?
Well, of course, this second red flag restart was because of the crash of Max Verstappen, which left Sergio Perez effective race leader and Lewis Hamilton in P2. So, of course, this start was very important for who was going to end up winning this race. And, of course, as we mentioned, on the first turn, Lewis's front wheels both locked up very strangely. There was a lot of smoke. It was very odd, and he didn't even make the turn. And that, we believe, is because he left his quote-unquote brake magic on. Now, brake magic, for those who don't know, is understood to be a setting used by Mercedes behind the safety car to help heat the brakes by altering, amongst other things, the brake bias settings. And this is coming from Formula One's official website. So Lewis left the setting on and forgot to turn it off once the safety car went back into the pit lane. Just an uncharacteristic mistake from a 7-time world champion driver. And let's move on to our second pit lane, who is, of course, Hamilton's teammate, Valtteri Bottas. Now, Bottas struggled all weekend. He was really, really far behind in the practice sessions, ended up qualifying P10, which I guess was a bit of an improvement, but definitely far behind what we expect from a Mercedes driver. And yet he finished P12. We had multiple DNFs over the course of this race, and Bottas lost places instead of making them up. So, of course, that's a no-point finish for both Mercedes drivers. Bottas was only ahead of the Haas drivers, the Williams drivers, and Lewis Hamilton after, of course, his lockup. And now Mercedes is unfortunately behind Red Bull in the Constructors' Championship by 26 points.
Now, Brady, our third pit lane isn't actually a driver today.
Really?
It's none other than Pirelli, the manufacturer and supplier of all tires for Formula One. Now, guys, we had some really strange situations happen today. We had 2 crashes that were the exact same, in the exact same position. We had a rear left tire lockup for both Max Verstappen and Lance Stroll. Lance Stroll's happened first. On the straight, a straight line, no crazy turns, it's just a straight line. we had them both veer into walls out of nowhere. Lance Stroll veered into a wall in front of the pit lane, closing the pit lane so other drivers couldn't even take advantage of a safety car to go change their tires. And that was when he was in P4. That was about the middle of the race. And then, of course, like we keep mentioning, we have Max Verstappen. That happened when he was in P1, 5 laps to go. Fortunately, he crashed into the other wall, even though it was in the same position. So people were still able to go into the pit lane. But, we have Pirelli and Formula One kind of try to save face by claiming that this was because there was debris on the track, that it wasn't their tires, the tires ran into something. But that's kind of hard to believe because same thing happened to the same wheel on both drivers in the same exact place, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but the team principals and the engineers didn't notice any issues with the car. There was no signal that this would happen. I mean, we were watching the race. We really didn't see anything on the track. And then a last thing to mention is that both drivers were on the hard compound tires, which isn't a tire that most people race with, but was part of their strategy in this particular race.
Yeah, it was eerily similar, seeing the parallels between those two crashes. It's hard to believe that there's anybody to blame but Pirelli in this situation. All right, well, that wraps up our polls and pit lane segment. Let's move on to our team recaps, huh? Now, for team recaps for this segment, we go in order of the finishing cars. So, of course, we start with P1 and Red Bull. Red Bull had a roller coaster of a race. Both drivers were excellent today. While they were on the track, they were phenomenal. Max Verstappen had a clear hold on the lead before his untimely crash in that straight that we just touched on. I mean, Red Bull had a perfect strategy as well. They managed to get Checo up through the top 10, all the way up to P2 early on in the race to defend against Lewis Hamilton. And you could see clearly Max was enjoying that gap that Checo was providing for him. Christian Horner also made a call to the FIA after Max's crash, recommending that they red flag the circuit just for safety reasons. And that actually, interestingly enough, allowed everybody to change to soft tires, which may have had a hand in Checo winning the race. I mean, of course, every driver on the grid was in soft compound tires, so it wasn't like there was an unfair advantage. But we know Checo is famous for his ability to take care of his tires, So putting him on a soft compound in a street circuit was a recipe for success. We alluded to this before, but there was no real reason to suspect any tire issues, at least for Max Verstappen on that straight. We heard from Ferrari that there was no data to suggest that there was excessive wear or maybe a puncture or anything like that.
No, and like we keep saying, both drivers were having a great race. Max would have won if this hadn't happened, so it was such a shock to everyone. Max was having a great race, passing Charles early on, taking the lead from him, and then of course this happens.
Yeah, and I mean, it could have gone even worse for Red Bull, believe it or not. We heard after the race that Sergio Perez's car nearly was retired in the last couple laps of the race due to a hydraulics issue. I mean, you could see on the broadcast, Checo crosses the finish line and all of a sudden he's stopping the car. He barely made it past the end of the race. It was a very close call for Red Bull, but luckily they were able to salvage the weekend, get Checo his second career win in Formula One, and remain ahead of Mercedes in both the Constructors and Drivers' Championships.
Next on our list, we have Aston Martin. So we have, like we said, first podium as Aston Martin. This is great news to hear. Both drivers had a great pace the whole time. Lance Stroll looked really great with his alternate tire strategy. Now, Lance Stroll started on hard tires. He was the only one to start on hard tires. And when every other driver went to pit, he didn't. They were on lap 30. He hadn't pit yet. He was in P4, which is the best he's been doing all season, and probably would have stayed up there for the rest of the race. It was looking really good for him. And then, of course, we have this unexpected crash that happened. And it's too bad that we weren't able to see the rest of his tire strategy play out, because I thought it was very astute, and I was really excited to see where it went from there. Next, though, we have Sebastian Vettel, who, although Lance Stroll had an awful day, Sebastian Vettel had an amazing day. He stretched his soft tires that he had earlier on in the race all the way to P1 at one point, was holding on to that position while everyone else was pitting. Of course, when he pitted later, he fell back down a little bit, but he was still able to keep a top 5 position for much of the race. Now, this is a very familiar track for Sebastian Vettel. He's done well here previously, and it's no surprise, really, if you look at his track record, that he got P2 on this track. Now, we have an interesting dichotomy between the two strategies and the two techniques that both drivers in Aston Martin used. For Stroll, we see that his performance in the race was very much thanks to his tire strategy, the fact that he was on the hard tires and was able to stay out longer. Now, with Sebastian Vettel, on the other hand, we really see his talent come out and the way he's able to just push the tires a little extra despite whatever tire strategy he did have. And of course, we have another interesting dichotomy where Stroll's crash hurt Stroll, but actually helped Sebastian Vettel by having that restart allow the times between the drivers to decrease and giving him an advantage.
Yeah, and the great thing about Sebastian stretching those soft tires at the beginning of the race is it allowed his hard compound tires, when he did eventually go to the pit lane, his hard compound tires were fresher than pretty much the entire grid. Lance Stroll, of course, did not make a pit stop before his crash, but Sebastian Vettel was the final driver on the grid to make a pit stop due to his ability to stretch those tires. And again, I'd love to talk about this again. Lance Stroll started P19 after crashing during qualifying and worked his way all the way up to P4 on one set of hard compound tires. This was a fantastic performance for Stroll, and it was pretty heartbreaking to see him crash like that.
And I mean, it's hard to say, obviously, because the crash really put a damper on things, but despite the crash, Lance Stroll should be proud of himself because he did a great performance today.
Absolutely. He's a kind of guy who people like to clown on a little bit, you know, thanks to Big Daddy Lawrence Stroll owning the team. And of course, last race at Monaco, he had his little moment in the spotlight with the broadcast team and all that. But Stroll is a great driver, and I think we absolutely saw that today. Let's move on to our next team, AlphaTauri. Now, AlphaTauri had their best race of the entire season today. Of course, we mentioned it was a great defensive race from Gasly. He was just on a different level with a well-deserved podium finish. But we also had a career weekend from Yuki Tsunoda, the rookie. Yuki qualified P8 and improved his position to P7. Very respectable performance for him, especially when he's surrounded by the likes of Carlos Sainz, Fernando Alonso, Daniel Ricciardo was in the mix. All very accomplished drivers, and a rookie Tsunoda was able to work his way in between them. This weekend was Yuki's first Q3 position and his first points finish since Bahrain, in which he finished P9. There was one point in the race I remember where Yuki went around the outside of Fernando Alonso. And I looked to you, Mary, during the race, and I said, God, he's got to feel good about that, huh? Mm-hmm. Taking over a driver as acclaimed and as renowned as Alonso in only your rookie season, only 5 races into your rookie season. Yuki really impressed today. One thing you may notice if you're looking at the final standings, the final grid positions at the end of the race, both AlphaTauris performed better than a Ferrari. We had Pierre Gasly in P3 finish above Charles Leclerc in P4, and we had Yuki Tsunoda in P7 finish above Carlos Sainz in P8. Just a very interesting dichotomy that you like to think about. Another thing we should talk about for AlphaTauri is they jumped Aston Martin in the Constructors' Cup, despite Sebastian Vettel finishing second.
That brings us to Ferrari. Now, Ferrari had high highs and low lows. You know, we start with Charles Leclerc on pole again, Carlos P5, 2 very good positions. But then Charles loses P1 in the first few laps. Carlos has an early lockup, has to go into the runoff area, which drops him temporarily outside the points. He really has to work his way back up, and which he did, so respects to him. He got back into the points with P8. Charles, despite losing pole, finished P4, so giving them a lot of points nonetheless, but still performing a little bit worse than we thought they would. Both drivers finished ahead of McLaren, so we have Charles ahead of Lando, Carlos ahead of Ricciardo, and this was really important because it jumps Ferrari ahead of McLaren in the Constructors' Championship. They were, right behind McLaren before this race, and because the fact that they were able to get both drivers up there enough, they were able to pass them.
And that's really interesting because, I mean, you look at just qualifying positions versus the race, the way they finished the race, and you think, wow, a bit of a disappointing day for Ferrari. But no, there's a silver lining there. They made progress in the Constructors' Championship. Speaking of McLaren, let's go to them next. They had a bit of a rough start. Lando Norris incurred a grid penalty during qualifying that pushed him from P6 all the way down to P9, and Ricciardo missed out on Q3 entirely, qualifying in P13. Now, both cars, right off the start of the race, were stuck in the midfield. There was a lot of traffic, they were overtaken, and they were fighting outside the points for quite a while. But Lando Norris especially was able to use that first red flag thanks to Lance Stroll to overtake a bunch of different cars and get back into points range. But it was in the final 2 laps where we had some fantastic driving from Lando Norris. Although he was in P5 at the restart, he fought Charles Leclerc and he fought Pierre Gasly for that P3 spot, and although he ended up finishing P5, it was a valiant effort. To watch those 3 go at it in the final 2 laps of the race was just fantastic.
And we have, a great moment at the end when Gasly wins and he's jumping out of the car, hugging everyone, and we have Charles and Lando come over, and, we can't really hear what they're saying, but they're hugging, they're talking, probably reflecting on that crazy little stint they just had where they were all like 3 wide trying to race each other.
It was really fun to see young drivers like that respect each other's craft and really have those great moments.
And I had said, right before we saw that, I hope Pierre and Charles have some cute French moments together. And just then, Charles popped up, gave Pierre a big hug. Couldn't be happier.
That is a motif we'll get back to, is you predicting events this weekend. Mm-hmm. But as for now, let's stick with McLaren and talk about Lando's teammate Ricciardo. Ricciardo, of course, had a bit of a disappointing qualifying. He had a disappointing Monaco Grand Prix, but he had a pretty good race today. I mean, he clawed his way up to P9 in the points. Nothing crazy, He benefited from a lot of DNFs of racers who qualified in front of him. We called it a P9 of circumstance, more so than a P9 of, I guess, grit. But listen, points are points.
That brings us to Alpine. Alpine had maybe an underwhelming day, but with good moments nonetheless. We have Alonso qualifying in Q3 with P9. He out-qualified Ocon. We have an interesting back-and-forth battle between Alonso and Tsunoda for much of the race. We have Yuki pass Alonso at one point, but then eventually Alonso made that up. He passes Yuki, he passes Daniel Ricciardo, he passes Carlos in those final 2 laps and secures that P6 position in the end. This was an absolutely vintage performance from Alonso, bringing back what we knew he had from years prior when he was a championship winner. And now, importantly, we have to talk about Ocon. Esteban Ocon missed out on Q3 during qualifying with P12, and then at the very early laps of this race, retired the car. We're not exactly sure why. We think it's because of loss of power. But, he was the first one into the pits and had to retire the car straight away. It was sad to see because I feel like he maybe could have put a good fight in today.
Ocon's had an excellent season so far, and I feel like Alpine could have taken a jump forward if it weren't for that early retirement, but it is what it is. Let's move on to our next team, Alfa Romeo. Big move around the grid for both Alfa Romeo drivers. Kimi Räikkönen, one of my favorite drivers, landed in the points for the first time this season. P10, he secured 1 point, and that brings Alfa Romeo's season total to 2 points, thanks to Antonio Giovinazzi's P10 finish last race. Kimi qualified in P14 and ended up in P10 for his first points of the season. Like I mentioned, Giovinazzi crashed during qualifying and began the race P20, but moved all the way up to P11. It was a pretty impressive race from Giovinazzi. He had some good moments, including holding off the Ferrari of Carlos Sainz for a couple of laps during the middle of the race. Carlos, it was very clear, was very frustrated behind this Alfa Romeo, who just seemed to have a little too much speed on the straights for Carlos to be able to weave his way through. Eventually, Giovinazzi did give up that position, but it was a good battle to watch nonetheless, and one that I'm sure Alfa Romeo will be referring back to when deciding whether or not to renew Giovinazzi's contract at the end of the season.
And another little interesting tidbit is that Alfa Romeo, of course, is the B team for Ferrari. So you see both Ferrari teams facing each other. That was fun to see. Next, we have Mercedes.
Mercedes?
Big yikes, they're all the way down here once again. This was absolute worst case scenario race for them. You said earlier that I had a motif of predicting things, and I am maybe a fortune teller because during the last red flag, everyone was setting up again. We were all so sad that Max crashed. He was going to win. He was going to be even further in the driver championship. He was going to be even further in the constructors championship. And I said, what if Lewis Hamilton went to the runoff area like we saw Carlos do at the beginning of the race, like we saw a bunch of people do during qualifying.
In turn one, nonetheless.
In turn one, what if he went into the runoff area and then we had a Checo, Vettel, Gasly podium? And guess what, guys? That's exactly what happened! And listen, we're a little excited about this. We got an interesting podium, one that we don't often see. But it is upsetting for Lewis because he had a fantastic drive up until that lockup. And if it wasn't for that lockup, Mercedes would have taken the lead in the race and then secured itself a lead in the Constructors' Championship as well as a Lewis lead in the Drivers' Championship. So really, they had everything to lose and they lost it all.
And this was all up to Lewis, too. Valtteri Bottas was outside the points for pretty much the entire race. So these leads would have been secured by Lewis alone.
And now that you mention that, it's interesting to say, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but Bottas really had an awful race. And an interesting thing to mention is that they did have different car setups. And we saw throughout practices and throughout qualifying that Bottas was really struggling in comparison to his teammate.
Let's move on to our final two teams, the first of which is Haas. Now, Haas did not even get close to scoring points, but by their standards, they had a pretty good race. Only one of their drivers was lapped. Mick Schumacher was not lapped during this race. Mick qualified P17 and finished P13 due to the many DNFs. And Mazepin, right behind him, qualified P18 and finished P14. The Haas pit crew, interestingly enough, this I thought was the most interesting part of Haas's race today. There was one point in time where Mick Schumacher was in the pit lane. He makes his pit, he drives off, and then stops. Not even, what did you say? It was 3 meters away from the pit?
Yeah, 3 meters away from where he was pitting.
And that's because the pit crew couldn't put the tire, I believe it was the front left or front right tire, was not all the way on the car. So they had to pick up Mick Schumacher's car, drag it back into the pit, reapply the wheel, and then send him on his way. Of course, this essentially affected nothing. He was far enough behind both Williams drivers where this didn't really make a difference, and he was far enough ahead of his teammate Mazepin where he was able to get out back in front without losing a position. But I thought it was a pretty interesting thing to watch. But one thing we do need to mention, P13 and P14 for the two Haas drivers, that makes for ahead of Lewis Hamilton. Mm-hmm. So that's something they can hang their hats on, you know?
Next, we have Williams, our final team of the day. Williams, overall, had a pretty okay day by their standards, but nothing special. We had a lot of circumstantial incidents that happened that put them down at the back. Russell, at one point, was very close to Bottas, which is a very interesting relationship we're following because Russell is the reserve driver for Mercedes, and there is speculation that he will probably replace Bottas. Now, after Max's red flag, we really thought that Russell was going to be able to maybe fight with Bottas to try to overtake him because he was right behind Bottas. But during the formation lap, during that last red flag, we see Russell go straight back into the pits and retire the car. And we are unsure exactly what happened. We think maybe it was an engine failure. They didn't really bring much attention to it at all. We just see a shot of him going back into the pits, and then we see on the graphic it say Russell out. But that was very interesting. The next interesting thing is Latifi. During Max's red flag, all the drivers were told to go back into the pit lane. As Latifi is approaching the pit lane, his engineer comes on the radio and says, "You can stay out of the pit lane." That was some interesting miscommunication. I don't know what was going on, but that was certainly not what he was supposed to do. He was supposed to go into the pit lane. This was a massive safety hazard, and because of it, he got a 10-second penalty, basically putting him all the way at the back of the grid. And he even said, it was a lonely day for me. And it really was. So Latifi was kind of on his own when it comes to racing other people, but also when it comes to his team. His team kind of let him out to dry today.
And those are two examples. Williams, as much as you can root for the underdogs in Williams, they're just shooting themselves in the foot during this race. I mean, with the failure of the car for Russell and then the failure of the engineers for Latifi, it's not hard to imagine that George Russell may want to be on his way out sooner rather than later, you know? Okay, now let's move on to our next segment, our Best Team Radio segment. Now this, of course, we are the Team Radio podcast, so we like to highlight the best moment on team radios from the race. And now this can be difficult sometimes. We were talking about this. You don't get too many team radio moments during the broadcast, and the ones you do get can be a little garbled sometimes.
Yeah, a little garbled, maybe a little boring.
The only people you can really hear clearly are the engineers, and sometimes you can't hear them at all. But we were able to secure quite the moment for you all. From Pierre Gasly, after crossing the finish line, P3, podium, his best finish of the season. He says, "No idea how I've done that. That was incredible. I have no idea how I've done that." And that was just a warming moment.
Of course, in the back, we have, you can hear all of AlphaTauri, we can hear the engineer clapping, everyone's so happy, they're saying good job, and you know, AlphaTauri is such a wholesome team. Really, it has a good environment that I think is much less toxic than the one we see in their sister team, Red Bull. And now, of course, like Brady said, in a couple hours, they'll release all of the radio moments, and we'll probably have something much more funny, but this is still a nice, wholesome moment we can share. And finally, that brings us to our Drive to Survive moment of the day, the moment we saw in the race that we think is going to be highlighted in the Netflix TV show Drive to Survive in dramatic fashion with a whole story arc and music and plot lines. And that moment actually is the 1-2 punch of Max's crash, which would have taken him out of the lead, but then followed by Lewis's disaster at the restart. I think there's going to be a whole episode dedicated to this, Brady.
I think so as well. We had plenty to talk about, so if there's not an entire episode dedicated to Azerbaijan 2021, I'll be pretty shocked. I mean, they have plenty of material. We don't know which team that they were with this weekend, but yeah, it's hard not to believe that they could get some juicy storylines and some good emotions out of their viewers. And that brings us to the end of our second episode of the Team Radio podcast, in which we covered the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. We'll see you right around June 20th, 21st for our third episode, in which we will be covering the French Grand Prix, round 7 of the Formula One season. Once again, my name is Brady.
And I'm Merritt.
Have a good one.
Beep beep.